Thank you all. I am Tom McTague. I'm the editor of the New Statesman, and I'm delighted to be here for today's discussion. I won't take up much time because I suspect Morris is going to overrun his 30-minute slot. But yeah, so we're going to do 30 minutes roughly, and then we'll have Morris and I will have a bit of a chat, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A, and I think we have some questions coming in online as well, so I will try to bring in some of those questions. But I will pass on to Lord Glasman of Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill for the fifth in a series of the Future of the Left project that Jonathan Rutherford has been putting on, and has been doing some great work. I'm sure you've seen some of the headlines about it. A quick thanks to Dean and to Julia for hosting. It's really great. So anyway, over to Morris.
So good morning everybody, and good to see you. I would definitely like to reiterate what Tom said and thank both Jonathan Rutherford and John Cruddas for engaging with the Labour tradition as the starting point of this work on the future of socialism. You both have been great comrades over these long years, and it still feels like we've only just begun. I began writing this in Kiev this Easter. The women walking into St. Stephen's Cathedral carrying wicker baskets filled with fruit, flowers and painted eggs. Bruvel's moral of the Madonna staring in desolate witness at the certainty of her son's death and his resurrection. The sound of the deep-bassed harmonics of the choir filled the vast blue basilica. It was extraordinary to witness this at a time of war, when the rockets fell at night on my neighbours' homes, shaking the walls of my rented flat. But overwhelmingly, the central story was death and resurrection, sin and redemption, that both are real. And it occurred to me as the people offered up their baskets to the priest, who doused them in holy water, while a shaft of sunlight caught the swirling purple smoke of incense, that this is precisely what we have been doing over these last 20 years, resurrecting the dead, restoring the tradition, which is ever ancient, ever new, to steal a quote from the Gospels. The prophet Ezekiel, to move on to more comfortable territory, spoke of how the old bones would walk again, and this, I think, is very much the spirit within which we work. The restoration of the Labour tradition is our goal, as both a political philosophy and a mode of government which provides the most reasonable framework for the renewal of our country by placing the interests and values of Labour back as the central organising principle. Our aspiration is to lead our movement, and this is based on following the working class. The age of restoration is the best description I can think of to describe the dominant contemporary political zeitgeist. I did not realise until I went to Trump's inauguration how much the word again mattered in Make America Great Again. And it brought to mind the old Blue Labour paradoxes we used when we began. The old is the new. Tradition is the basis of modernisation. Monarchy is the best defence of democracy. Christianity will redeem citizenship. To which I would add, after my trip to DC, republics long for kingship. This is as true for France and Germany as it is for the United States. This particular space of conservative socialism, of Burkean Marxism, of Polanyian Aristotelianism, monarchical socialism, of Blue Labour, continues to deepen and to grow, in large part due to John and Jonathan's stubborn fidelity to its possibilities. I was told in church in Easter in Ukraine that gratitude is the first virtue in the Orthodox tradition, and I would like to express mine to both of you. I would also, following Tom, like to extend that to Julia Mazin and Dean Godson to rank things in their right order, and to all at Policy Exchange for welcoming us. We placed our work here not only because the prospect of not having to engage with progressives was such an attractive one. The predominant emotional and intellectual condition of the progressive mind is one of worry. Sometimes they are just worried, and at other times they are quite worried, but most of the time they are very worried. And this can take quite extreme forms, including being terribly worried or even petrified. And what they are worried about is both imminent and abstract, a terrifyingly real yet elusive thing which we call the future. They thought that things could only get better, but that did not turn out to be a true statement at any level. The future, in short, is not what it was. I will return to this theme later in the talk. It is enough to note here that I hold to be true that there is nothing more sterile and demoralising than an outdated modernism. Blue Labour is not moved by the call of apocalyptic Gnostic heresy. We understand that we are doomed to continued existence here on earth for at least the next millennia or so, and feel our task is to make the world as mundane and sublime as we possibly can. There is just the continued existence of our miraculous species on this miraculous earth, and politics is nothing other than how we live together on this particular bit of it, a task which is overwhelmingly mundane and completely sublime. Our approach should be one of resolute wonderment. Bernard Crick, whose In Defence of Politics is treasured in the Blue Labour canon, wrote that to think of the growth and survival of British Labour is to be impressed not with the efficacy of a single doctrine, but with the wonder of politics. Not having to justify our work to progressives was not, however, the only reason we came to Policy Exchange. We also respected the level of research, particularly in defence, and as important, there remains a shared concern with the defence of our liberties and the threat posed by lawyers to the rule of law as a righteous complement to parliamentary sovereignty, but no more than that. To resist the dominion of law's empire is what might be called an area of alignment. Dean and Julia promised us that there would be no interference in the internal logic of what we are doing, and that promise has been kept so far. So, Dean has said more than once, and smiling each time, that he felt like the Prussian official inviting Lenin to board the SEAL train when he invited us in. The problem with that analogy, Dean, is that I despise Lenin, Bolshevism and communism. Marx's analysis of capitalism is exemplary and of continued relevance. His ideas of alienation, commodification and the tendency of capital to centralise ownership and control are vital to any understanding of the contemporary economy. His politics, however, remains at the level of Polytoynbee at best. And then Lenin took it to a whole different level. So Bolshevism is perhaps best described as Fabianism on acid, a progressive form of mass murder, torture, oppression and exploitation. Burke's reflections on the revolution in France is in a different cosmos to any of Marx's writings. I do believe that if Marx were alive today, he'd be in the Lib Dems. If you read the 18th Brumaire, you'd see what I mean. I consider the Chinese Communist Party as the most accurate contemporary embodiment of that demonic tradition of wickedness and sin, of utilitarian progressive oppression and exploitation. They despise faith and tradition, God and the good, the Sabbath and fellowship, preferring to worship at the altar of GDP and child mortality rates. Their mountain of words is only equalled by the Everest of skeletons that stack up in their pursuit of progress. If you bear in mind that a person was killed for every word that Stalin published, and then you realise that his collected works stack up to 17 thick volumes, then maybe you can begin to glimpse the horror contained in that one word, progress. They steal good words and then they turn them into weapons of tyranny and isolation. The Labour tradition can be defined in one way by its loathing and rejection of communism. It is not a fraternal sectarianism, but a fight of irreconcilable traditions. Ernest Bevin, may his name be blessed, expressed this most forcefully, and it was embodied in the rejection of the Popular Front as the political strategy to defeat fascism when Labour went into alliance with the Tories instead, the War Cabinet being Labour's greatest administration. Winston Churchill and Anthony Eden did the foreign policy, but we ran the country. Attlee, Bevin, Morrison, leading the domestic fight against fascism, and to our eternal glory, as VE Day reaches its 80th anniversary, we really did defeat fascism, really defeat, and real fascism, in a coalition with the Conservatives. Unlike any single Popular Front movement in the rest of Europe, we won. Unlike the communists, we never did a deal with Hitler. This was indeed our finest hour. I honour our martyrs dead with a grateful heart. May their memory and their families be forever blessed. It is good to know that the Morning Star still survives, thanks to Lenin's gold, but it is even better to know that virtually nobody reads it. It should perhaps merge with the Fabian magazine and create a popular front weekly that could break new ground in having no readers at all. Call it the Progressive, perhaps. It can call for a popular front against the far right to defeat Trump, Farage, the AFD, the Front National, or whatever they call it now. On the contrary, I argued that the Popular Front strategy was a condition for the victory of fascism. There is one thing that the working class is absolutely sure of. It has no desire whatsoever to live under communist rule. If you can polarise around that, you win. I would suggest that the Labour tradition itself is the greatest antidote to fascism, as history has proved. More democracy, the dignity of labour, mutual obligation, a reverence for the inherited institutions, the restoration of the integrity and effectiveness of our armed forces, the integrity and trust of the police, the public ownership of our strategic assets and a preference for industry over finance, an emphasis on class rather than other aspects of identity, and a profound respect for the decencies of family life, respect for your mum and your nan, who is most certainly not a man, and a most special place reserved for private sector unions who uphold the dignity of labour under extreme conditions. They are our parents and our teachers. The Workers' Rights Bill concentrates on the wrong thing, grievance procedures rather than collective bargaining, which is one of the central tenets of Blue Labour economic policy. The future lies with industrial trade unions within an industrial strategy that requires half the universities be closed and restored as vocational colleges. The future is vocational, not professional. It lies on the shop floor, not with HR. This is the politics of anti-fascism. God save the King. And this is a central part of this talk today, that there needs to be a reckoning with the sins of socialism. There needs to be an understanding, a confession and then repentance, a public repentance for our sins and the sins of our ancestors. Only then can we face ourselves and our people with a renewed sense of trust. Blue Labour rejects contractual methods. We are covenantal people, bound to the past and to the future, and one of the central bonds is that of the labour movement itself. We rightly glory in the magnificence of our labour tradition, the sublime paradox of its uniqueness, but we also have to recognise the bad and to guard against it, to resist it, and to defeat it. It seems that this is true in every generation. I will give two immediate examples of this, of radically different levels of importance. Tom, congratulations on being appointed editor of the New Statesman. I am far from being alone in being delighted by that, not least because you have a fine sensibility for the disenchanted resilience of the working class of our country. Their sense of the sacred, however, of morality, their country, their family, their work, their friends, are a violation of all that the founders of the New Statesman held dear. Their scientific socialism led not only to the establishment of the LSE, which is of course a sin in itself, but of the Fabians. Eugenics was the first of their social policies, and an unwavering loyalty to Stalin and the Soviet Union the keynote of their foreign policy. The New Statesman was what we would now call their media platform. Tom, I urge you to read H.G. Wells' interview with Stalin published in your magazine. It makes George Galloway's interview with Saddam Hussein look combative. He actually asked Stalin, it's an incredible read, I urge you to do it, preferably when drunk. He actually asked Stalin, and this is at the height of the terror, how he manages to stay so humble and yet be so great at the same time. And Stalin replied that it came naturally to him, that his obligation to the party and the revolution made any individual sacrifice a small thing, and he probably meant it. The New Statesman actively supported the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and opposed Labour joining the war cabinet. The Labour Party, thank God, did not, despite intense campaigning from the Fabians, call itself the Socialist or Social Democratic or Democratic Socialist Party. It chose life and called itself Labour, the human factor of production most threatened by capitalism. So, Tom, is it possible to write about this new era without a lingering sense of condescension and contempt for reform voters? Is it possible to be faithful to your understanding and to the inherited ethos of the magazine? This is the kind of reckoning I'm talking about. I am suggesting that repentance is a necessary path to renewal, as with it you can explore the complexities and nuance of working class politics without pejorative adjectives, far right, nativist, all the rest of it. With you can engage with it with resolute wonderment rather than a patronising worry. And just to say, anything with the word new in it is a warning in itself. The second reckoning with sin is altogether more serious, profound and demonic than the editorial stance of the New Statesman. This concerns what I refer to as grooming gangs. Why they are called grooming gangs is a bit suspicious to me. If my mother said that someone was well groomed, it meant that they looked smart and respectable. It also refers to a significant but ultimately minor figure in a marriage ceremony, the groom. In other words, grooming and grooms were a good thing, and this was picked up in the marketing of men's hair products in the 1970s like Brill Cream, and which were repackaged as grooming products. As a young socialist, I rejected all aspects of grooming as aspirational affectation, but that is not really an argument against it. I refer to this as the systematic rape of underage girls by men of overwhelmingly Pakistani origin through the use of drink, drugs, payment, manipulation and coercion. It is the ultimate desecration of human life. It is completely and totally out of order and needs to be brought to light with a statutory national inquiry. Our entire body politic is poisoned by this. It erodes trust and generates hate. My day job is building a classic community organisation in Grimsby. Small town working class organising on the East Coast is important, and the churches and the unions are at the heart of it. The old is the new. I wish to publicly acknowledge the incredible work of Jonathan Lang in building the organisation in Grimsby. It is orthodox Zelinsky organising, and one of its rules is to work inside the experience of your people and outside the experience of your enemies. The method of learning this is the one-to-one conversation, and I've met a lot of people in Grimsby, and they have been my greatest teachers over the past 5 years. It didn't take long before a local Anglican priest, who was also an Irishman, who had served his parish for 40 years, informed me that if I wanted to understand anything about the people of Grimsby, I had to understand the distinction, and apologise for my language, I'm quoting, I had to understand the distinction between shit happens and out of order. I asked for clarity, and he said that shit happens is like your wife being unfaithful, losing your job, or being burgled and then offered your own stuff back at a price in the pub the next day. That shit happens. And out of order, I asked, with middle-class wonderment. Robbing a blind man, he said, or spiking the drink of a vicar at a wake. I followed his eyes, and a boy of about 16 was being pushed in a wheelchair by an older man. The priest said, he did that to me last week. We sat in silence for a while, and then he said, I had nothing to do with what happened to him. For those here who have studied PPE, SPS, or political philosophy, we can say we didn't get many lectures on the distinction between shit happens and out of order, but it is what Aristotle describes as doxa, which is the common sense of the people, their moral economy, the very basis of a democratic politics. I began to think it was the most important distinction in political philosophy. Well, when shit happens, that's how it goes, and there is nothing the state should really do about it. It is necessary suffering. Sometimes it's your fault, and sometimes it isn't, but out of order is the meaning of politics, which is to make things in order. In a previous life, I may have written an academic paper called Shit Happens and Out of Order in Aristotle's Ethics, and played many games of patience while I did it. But I am also in the new era, thank God. Rape gangs systematically preying on young girls is what they call bang out of order. It is an abomination that must be purged from the body politic. The fact that it has been considered as shit happens rather than out of order is a stain on me and the entire political class. It is time to resurrect some more traditions from the Socialism, the Purge and the show trial. The difference being that the accused in this case are not, by definition, innocent. It is a festering wound, it is still going on, and it has not been stopped. The role of the televised trial is to witness the reason why it has not been stopped. This must cease to be party political and be understood as properly political, as it concerns the health of the body politics. This is primary matter and primal politics. It involves sex, rape, class, religion, but it also involves governance, social services, childcare, the police force, local authorities, national governments. The sin is total and everywhere. In the Pakistani community, with the parents, but it also lies with the council and the police. It lies with the politics. It is not a legal issue. It is primal politics. And the restoration of trust requires an exorcism in which this darkness is brought to light. The sin is poisoning the well. It generates fear and loathing, to quote Hunter Thompson. And this talk is a sequel to one I gave last October at the Sheldonian in Oxford called Blue Labour, Why Only Socialism Can Redeem Conservatism. I'm not going to repeat, you will be grateful to hear the entire talk, but the argument made there is essential to understanding what I'm saying now. The essence of the argument is that the distinctive English form of conservatism is one of the glories of the world, and before it was captured and decimated by the wild weeds of Trotskyite liberal free market fanatics in the name of Thatcherism, it understood important things about how to act in the world and about what the world was like, that the enigma of a curious silence was of greater political virtue than an angry denunciation, that there was primary matter alive in the world in terms of attachment, faith, nation, race and home, and it was necessary to accommodate those to an ever more complex task of self-government. I think that so much of what is distinctive and good about our country is the result of the strength of conservatism. Restoration rather than reform was their approach. Self-governing corporate bodies were preferred to state-directed departments. I argued last October, however, that conservatism has been almost entirely captured by a form of revolutionary liberalism that is hostile to a stable form of life in the form of finance capitalism, and has left both the Conservative Party and our country in a palsied and perilous state. The genius of conservatism was precisely its understanding that tradition was a condition of modernisation, that solidarity was more important than liquidity, that society requires a sense of the sacred if it is to flourish, that sacrifice was as important as choice, that the monarchy meant more than the market, that meaning was more important than choice, and they've entirely lost it. It is a distinctive feature of British history that the pioneer of industrialisation and the home of finance capital also preserved the monarchy, parliament, common law and the established church. This was the mighty achievement of conservatism. It was conservatism that restored the ancient constitution, doubled down on the monarchy, church and parliament, while establishing public parks, extending grammar schools and placing limits on the market. The Conservative Party itself was born in opposition to the repeal of the Corn Laws. It invented municipal socialism in Birmingham, of all places, clean water and an affordable railway system. It defied the logic of the free market in human beings and nature through the elevation of covenantal institutions, such as the monarchy, the church and the armed forces. Conservatism successfully defeated Nazism, republicanism and communism, and yet it has proved incapable of resisting liberalism. It has lost its sense of the sacred, of tradition, of nation. Tom, take heart. The New Statesman is in better condition than the Conservative Party, although the Spectator is showing signs of life. The penetration of progressive liberalism has emptied the Conservative Party of conservatism. In doing so, it has eviscerated the Conservative Party as a living political body. It shows no sign of resurrection. I wonder in my idle moments what a Thatcher tribute band should be called, and I can't improve on Snatcher. The same fate awaits Labour, as it has abandoned both socialism and conservatism in order to embrace a procedural liberalism that is hostile to political action and solidarity. On May Day we bore witness to the Watcher, County Durham, the birthplace of the Labour movement in terms of the creation of burial, building and mutual insurance societies, the pioneer of the provision of clean water, midwives and schooling by the Labour movement itself, has been Labour for 100 years. And after May Day, Reform has 65 seats and Labour has 4. Our cradle has become our tomb. And the fundamental starting point of Blue Labour is the argument that the Labour Party was precisely not the Liberal Party. And it turned out to be a river with many currents running through it. Some of them are philosophical and find their source in Aristotle and what is now called virtue ethics, taking in Aquinas and Alistair MacIntyre on the way. Some are Christian, ranging from the dissenting tradition based on association, liberty and conscience, through that of Catholic social thought, and its critique of capitalism based on the dignity of labour, local democracy, solidarity and the stewardship of nature. These in turn were rooted within a biblical tradition, which first articulated that human beings and nature were sacred and not simply resources for the accumulation of power or money. Pharaoh turned out to be a contemporary reality, from Amazon to China, and we thought that mercy, kindness and righteousness were necessary to resist this dominion. While Blue Labour expanded and intensified, there was a shared recognition that all these things were embodied in the Labour tradition itself, and their recovery was essential for its renewal. It also became clear that any politics that could draw inspiration from the Pilgrimage of Grace and the Putney debates, from Archbishop Laud and Thomas Winstanley, from Saul Alinsky and Ernest Bevin, from Edmund Burke and Karl Polanyi, was not going to find its home within a movement dominated by Whiggish assumptions. The roots of Labour lie in its covenantal bond with the British working class. The culture and experience of workers shaped the form of the Labour movement. It was of them, by them and for them, and that clearly is no longer the case. The steady disaffection of the working class from their party is the source of our progressive palsy. When you win less than 34% of the vote and gain 71% of the seats in Parliament, it is more reminiscent of the Soviet Union under Brezhnev than the renewal of social democracy. The party is dominant, but it is not hegemonic, and as Gramsci went on to argue, all manner of morbid symptoms pertain. Blue Labour also began as a recognition of the sadness and demoralisation that had fallen upon the party, movement and tradition by 2008. It was compromised, lacking in vitality and severed from its roots of renewal, relationally and conceptually. Things don't only get better, and the lack of understanding of loss and tragedy required a rearticulation of the fundamental tenets of the Labour tradition and the belief that these are both relevant and true. The first truth is that human beings are not commodities, but creative and social beings longing for connection and meaning. The second is that nature is not a commodity either, but a condition of life and a sacred inheritance. The Labour tradition also asserted that democracy is the best way to resist the domination of the rich and the educated, and that the leadership and participation of the working class was central to this. Further, that local democracy is vital, as well as forms of economic democracy that can hold state and market powers to account, a democracy locational and vocational. More than that, Labour drew upon historical memory and not only rational argument. It drew upon the Norman yoke and the tradition of the freeborn for the solidarity required by its associations. It not only demanded a human status for labour, but a move from the contractual to the covenantal. The human status of labour required the binding of capital to reciprocal obligations, the strengthening and not the abolition of the inheritance institutions such as Parliament and the common law, and the restoration of the ancient constitution. Labour was rooted in class, but was a national party, and its internationalism was rooted in democratic nation states, in which sovereignty was required in order to domesticate capital. Within the Labour tradition, the liberties were held to be sacrosanct, and there were four fundamental forms. Freedom of religion, in which no one could be coerced in their faith, and that meant freedom of religious practice and from any violent coercion in religion. Freedom of conscience, in that no one could be coerced in their beliefs. Freedom of expression, in that people were free to speak, create, and free to reject and criticise. The fourth, these are the liberties, they're not rights. The fourth was freedom of association, which was the fundamental form of the trade union movement, which was banned for a century before it was accepted. Within Blue Labour, liberty and democracy are not opposed but mutually supportive political practices, a sacred inheritance. The ancient constitution, with its balance of interests, common law and parliamentary sovereignty, defies rationality in the name of a higher reason. Blue Labour was also born of a recognition that any vital political tradition and movement has to go beyond rational philosophy and embrace paradox to combine seemingly contradictory elements in new forms. Labour itself is a paradoxical tradition, far richer than its present form of economic utilitarianism and legal progressivism. The Labour tradition is not best understood as the living embodiment of the liberal communitarian debate or as a variant of the European Marxist social democratic tension. It is robustly national and international, conservative and egalitarian, Christian and secular, republican and monarchical, democratic and elitist, radical and traditional, and it is at its most transformative and effective when it defies the status quo in the name of ancient as well as modern values. The Labour tradition has a vast and varied assortment of traditions, stories and accomplishments, great and small, and can tell a story of how things could get better out of the materials inherited from the past, and yet the technical managerialism of its dominant ideology cannot draw upon its history for its renewal. That is their weakness, and that is our strength. This type of political tradition is to be distinguished from matters of philosophy. Philosophical arguments, like policy proposals, aspire to be universal, coherent and reasonable. Such demands may be useful at the final stages of a policy review when specific recommendations have to be ordered and ranked, but remains unsuited to either political action or ethics. Historical continuity, democracy, the necessity of extemporized action, and the demands of leadership render politics contingent, comparative, and paradoxical in form. Ideas or values are not ultimate and singular in politics, but contested and related. The English nation, above all, is deeply synthetic in form, constituted by different tribes and peoples, but generated an unprecedented form of common law, common language, and an inheritance of a common wealth. Its political parties and movements have been stubbornly synthetic too, a matter of blending folk and academic concerns through a politics of interests. Political movements which are rooted in the lives and experiences of people bring together new constellations of existing political matter. What to philosophers is an incoherence can be a source of vitality and strength to a political tradition which contests with others for democratic power over its vision of the common good. So two ancient political traditions came together in the Labour movement. One could almost call them ancestors. On one side was the Aristotelian notion of the good life and the common good. In this, the importance of politics, of virtue, understood as good doing rather than do-gooding, through a pursuit of a common life between estranged interests, were carried into the political life of the nation. The founders of the Labour movement understood the logic of capitalism as based upon the maximisation of returns on investment and the threat this posed to their lives, livelihoods and environment, but they did not embrace class war and clung stubbornly to an idea of a common life with their rulers and exploiters and the democratic renewal of their inherited institutions. The Labour idea of the person, in which the plural institutions of civil life have a vital effect on the flourishing of the individual and are inseparable from it, are explicitly Aristotelian and conservative. And this is an important root of the conservatism in the Labour tradition, a concern with the preservation of status, limits on the market, an attachment to place, starting with the common sense, the doxa of the people, rather than with external values, with a strong commitment to a common life. This is also a direct link to the Tudor statecraft traditions of the 16th century, self-consciously Aristotelian, which engaged with the balance of interest within the realm, pioneering endowment to promote the sciences and commerce, developing apprenticeships and slowing enclosures. The Commonwealth men of the early 20th century, of which G.D.H. Cole and R.H. Tawney were active participants, are part of that tradition. Tom, could I have a glass of water, please? The second ancestral tradition within which Labour was embedded is that which followed the Norman conquest and which actively pursued the idea of the balance of power, within the ancient constitution and the rights of freeborn Englishmen. It was on the basis of the violation of customary practice that they resisted the subsequent enclosures and the assertion of royal prerogative in the name of Parliament and the liberties threatened by the domination of one institution alone. Labour takes its place within a far longer national tradition that values a legal and democratic order that is both transformative and traditional in simultaneous motion. Parliamentary socialism, the national commonwealth, whichever way Labour chose to describe itself in its first 50 years, acknowledged its attachments to the language and sensibility of the politics of the Commonwealth. and a central role for the inherited institution of governance that represented the interests of what used to be known as the Commons, the House of Commons not being the least of these. The early theorists of labour economics, Thirlwell and Blatchford, had a commitment to natural law in which there were prescribed limits as to how a person could be treated by political and economic authorities. In England in particular, these natural laws were assumed to have existed in this country before the conquest, so they were not abstract, but embedded in the political history of the nation. Democracy and common law were used as ways to constrain the domination of the monarchy. Parliament was vital to this, as was the Church. This sensibility found labour form in the work of Blatchford and Morris and the guild socialism of Cole, of Hobson and Penty. It is far too rarely acknowledged that alone in Europe, labour succeeded in generating a workers' movement that was not divided between Catholic and Protestant or between secularists and believers, but the movement itself provided the common life within which these potentially antagonistic forces could combine in pursuit of the common good. In cities like Glasgow and Liverpool, as well as London and Birmingham, this was an extraordinary achievement. This is perhaps the most distinctive feature of the labour tradition as opposed to social democracy in Europe, which was far more explicitly secularist in form. The London dock strike of 1889 is a classic expression that formed the labour movement and of the labour movement in action, built on the assumption that only organised people could resist exploitation and a forging of an alliance between Irish and local workers, brokered by the Catholic Church and the Salvation Army. The local labour representation committees were the new institutions within which the previously unrelated forces met and within which leaders were elected, strategy discussed and actions planned. It is here that the labour aristocracy of skilled workers who had lost their status and the smallholders who had lost their land made their appearance, drawing upon customary practice as a means of defying managerial prerogative. The courage of the strikers was remarkable. To disrupt trade was viewed as unpatriotic and seditious, as the British Empire was a maritime emporium with London as its hub, and the force of the navy and the army as well as the police was threatened against the strikers. The laws of the maritime economy, freely contractual, was held to apply to the port, which was excluded from territorial legislation. To build a successful political coalition on the basis of stable employment and wages was a great founding achievement of labour politics. Cardinal Manning, accompanied by William Booth and the Salvation Army band, led the striking dockers in their march, and it made it very difficult for the employers to use force and depict them as an undisciplined rabble. The sheer ferocity of the market storm within which labour was born in the 19th century, the scale of the dispossession of property, status and assets generated by the first ever free market in labour and land, the simultaneous enclosure of the common lands, the criminalisation of association, the scrapping of apprenticeships and the eviction and proletarianisation of the peasantry meant that the only port in the storm was the security that people found in each other. The burial given by the cooperative societies is a classic example of the retrieval of status generated by the labour movement, the dignity of death given by solidarity in life. The pauper's grave was one of the most fearful fates of enclosure and dispossession. It was a combination of subs paying membership, cooperation with chapels and churches, and the practices of mutuality and reciprocity that provided the resources out of which a human status for the person could be retrieved and retained. The reverence for life, the honour given to each member through their membership and dues, were not drawn from a secular or modernist ethic, but a radical solution was fashioned from traditional assumptions and practices. Labour as a radical tradition was crafted by both workers and Christian institutions as they confronted the hostility of both an exclusivist state and an avaricious market. They called their ideology Socialism and their party Labour, and I remain faithful to their memory. Tom, how much longer have I got?
You're overdrawn.
I'm overdrawn.
By about 10 minutes.
Oh, really? Okay. You know, that's the paradox of my writing. I always write too much and say too little. I have to live with it. Okay, so just accept that I write a fantastic critique of globalisation. Okay. I really go into it and how it completely decimates politics and leaves no way, and there's nothing, there's no history, there's no space, that we've lived through that for 40 years. I got a very long discourse on why things don't only get better and why that is perhaps the most stupid political sentence ever said. So, I mean, basically, I'll get to the point, is that that within this period of globalization, there's a whole load on Trump and the end of the era and what the new era looks like. You can click on the link, as they say, and I'll give it to Policy Exchange for those of you who can bear to read it. But the whole point is that the categories of labour, land and money were rendered outside of political contestation, and each was defined as a commodity. This whole period from Thatcher through Major, through Blair, through Brown was a nightmare of commodification and then state power, which led to the disintegration of society. All these assumptions destroyed conservatism in a really profound way. And my argument is that the same fate will befall this government unless it moves into the space that conservatives vacated. As Leonard Cohen says, everybody knows. Reform is a working class insurrection against the progressive ruling class, and the only way to counter it is for the Labour government to lead the insurrection, to celebrate the collapse of the era of globalisation, to embrace the space of Brexit, the renewal of the Commonwealth, the restoration of vocation, the primacy of Parliament, the integrity of our peace, the effectiveness of our armed forces, the protection of our borders, and the resurrection of Labour as the tribune of the working class. For those looking for guidance within the Labour tradition, I recommend, as John Quadras did in 2009 in the New Statesman, while it's on, R.H. Tawney's essay, The Choice Before the Labour Party. Written in the aftermath of the 1931 wipeout and acting as a coroner, he wrote that the cause of the Labour government's death were neither murder nor misadventure, but pernicious anemia producing general futility. He wrote that it crawled slowly to its doom, but the gunpowder was running out of it from the moment it assumed office and was discovered on inspection to be surprisingly like sawdust. He concluded that the greatest weakness of Labour is the lack of a creed. The Labour Party is hesitant in action because divided in mind. This is not me talking, this is R.H. Tawney. It does not achieve what it could because it does not know what it wants. There is, he says, a void in the mind of the Labour Party which leads us into intellectual timidity, which keeps policy trailing tardily in the rear of realities. Ever ancient, ever new. The Labour tradition itself provides the direction we need. Only through a retrieval of its conservatism can socialism be good. Thank you.
Well, that was wonderful. Thank you, Maurice. So I'll try and cut down our chat and to open it to questions.
Lunch has been cancelled, so we can drift a bit.
Has it? Right,
Yeah.
okay. So yeah, we can drift a bit. I think I had permission earlier from Jonathan. So please stick with us while we have a chat. Maurice, I mean, listening to you, I always find you completely fascinating. We've had many conversations sort of like this over the years. And listening to that speech in particular, I remember this quote that Boris Johnson said to me, where he said, "All romantics need the mortar of cynicism to hold themselves up," and he was referring to himself as a romantic, and that he needed this kind of cynical attitude to be able to get to sort of survive in politics. And I always thought, actually, you're a cynic with the kind of romance over the top, and that's you've inverted it. And I think about you, and I think that you're saying that socialism needs conservatism to survive, and you've made the opposite case. But I do wonder whether, at what point the left are starting to say, well, are you the opposite? Have you just become conservative, and you think conservatism needs a sort of dose of socialism? Like, which is there a point when it kind of crosses over for you?
So. I mean, I had a really close friendship with Roger Scruton. That was very important to me. There's a whole load of stuff I didn't read. You'd be grateful to know about the retrieval of a home in the world. What is politics? Politics is about having some status as a human being that's not simply a commodity or an administrative unit of a centralised state. So this is based on family relationships. So what I'm arguing actually is that Labour was much more profoundly conservative as a party and a movement than the Conservative Party. This idea of restoration, of retrieval, of mutual aid, of the burial societies, the building societies, was a desperate attempt to try and retrieve a human status in a dehumanised and desacralised world. Now, what's happened to the Conservatives is that they got completely desecrated by Thatcher and the market. What happened to us was a double movement, is that we lost all faith in our socialist economics and completely surrendered to globalisation. Do you remember Blair's speech? The only thing I really remember him ever saying is, as surely as spring follows winter, so globalisation, technology, borderlessness, that there was nothing you could do about it politically, you could only engage with it. Now the point is right now is that era is over. I mean, that's what I really witnessed in DC, was that they are not, the worst thing you could be is a globalizer, you know. They really are serious about protectionism, about reindustrialization, about those things. So what I'm saying, Tom, is that it was a madness for Labour to ever abandon its tradition, you know.
It's traditional conservatism.
Yeah, well, what's called conservative, but that really is what Labour is. It's to preserve the human status of Labour under conditions of capitalism.
You could say that Tony Blair's attitude there is kind of Oakeshottian in a way, because he's saying you've just got to manage the ship of the state. You've just got to sail in the conditions that exist and sort of adapt to it.
He really got rid of the ship.
Right.
You know, that's the point, that all the institutes. So it was really, how do you comply with the demands of global capitalism? So that was the knowledge economy. That was the whole thing about everybody going to university and transferable skills. And it turned out that it was absolutely mistaken, that the future is definitely one that has to have, if our sovereignty and liberty is to be protected, an armed forces capable of defending our borders, of industrial weapons production. And we are in very bad shape to do that, because those are the teleology of globalization turned out not to be true.
Well, I suppose that's sometimes I wondered, you know, you're obviously cynical about the notion of progress and whether we can progress, but at the same time you're kind of radical and you still believe it. You still go up to Grimsby and you kind of devote so much time to the idea that you can make things better.
Oh, you can. No, this is what we are in a. I just want to share the good news, everybody. Politics is back. This is the terrifying reality for our ruling class, is that the people of the country are making their views known extremely clearly. They definitely think that there is a better path ahead, that we're now really living now for the first time through the realities of Brexit, that you can't, you know, transfer out political decisions to supranational bodies. We can have an industrial strategy. You know, we can support Ukraine. And I do wish to say to the Ukrainians who are here how much I've been inspired by you these last 2 years for actually fighting for your country and for your liberty against a very authoritarian state. All of this is now, Tom, it's real. So I don't consider social. So what I'm saying is this whole idea of progressivism is like a natural historical process leading to greater individualism and a collective state and the priority of law and justice. It tries to eliminate politics entirely. And what I'm saying is politics is back and everything is up for grabs in that way.
And your conception of progress and how you get there, I mean, it does sound very Scrutonian. I think Scruton has this line, doesn't he, that conservatism is kind of fated, is a kind of fateful pursuit of sort of rejuvenating what has been lost, but you're never able to succeed in rejuvenating what is lost, but you get something new out of that, which is the kind of through the process of resistance.
It's resistance.
But he also talks about that through this sort of acknowledging the original sin. That's what he sort of, you try to deal with your original sin, which is to have changed, and by seeking to go back, you create something new. That sounds to me sort of what you're saying, this kind of language of sin.
Well, that was the whole conversation with Roger Scruton, was I couldn't understand how he could be a conservative and support capitalism. And that was the nature of the conversation, because what the market does is, it's early to use such words, but it commodifies the human being, it disrupts relationships, it gives a primacy to greed and individualism. And I couldn't understand why he embraced.
He didn't originally, did he? In
No,
the meaning of conservatism.
Yeah, exactly, and he didn't ultimately. I mean, towards the end, there was a shift there. But that's what I'm saying is the Labour movement was a kind of miracle in my eyes, because it precisely resisted this dehumanisation of the individual. It gave political agency to people who were excluded, but it wasn't revolutionary, it wasn't violent, it wasn't class war, but it was class consciousness. I mean, this is a treasure to be renewed and restored.
I mean, for those of you who pay close attention to some of the language that comes out of number 10, I think you can hear Morris sort of somehow refracted through a series of different people in there, and then it comes out in some form.
What have you been smoking?
Well, he talks about the Prime Minister will talk about putting up enforcing the border is not about hatred of foreigners; it's about love of country. Now, he said that in his speech, conference speech, which was a kind of Scrutonian line. But I always had the thought that you had sort of dripped into his ear somehow through number 10, perhaps. But you also hear it from people inside number 10 who speak much more passionately about the grooming gangs, rape gangs, than you actually hear from the government. And so I wonder, why is it that the way that you've spoken tonight, the way that you do hear people in the Labour Party talking about this, doesn't come through in sort of the official language?
Well, that's where we are. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, Gramsci said about the interregnum, is that the old is dead, but the new is yet to be born. That there is a fraternisation of opposites and all manner of morbid symptoms pertain. I still can't find a better description of what we're living through. So all the assumptions of New Labour and the third way have proved to be sociologically superficial, philosophically untenable, and practically useless. That's the reality we've got to face, is that it's not an accurate description of the direction of the world. Now we're in an era of nation states, of armies, soldiers, industry. When it comes to conservatism, I've got no time whatsoever for European conservatism, which is really weird and horrible. It's like a different planet, has none of the gentle and tender sensibilities of the English form. And what really is happening, Tom, is that the Prime Minister of number 10 is engaging with reality, electoral reality and geopolitical reality. And that means it's got to do something that I don't think has ever been done, which is turn things around in office. But they're Labour people and the tradition is there. I think that the battle is fully waging at the moment as to which will dominate.
Well, one final question, before I throw it open. I mean, you're obviously, I feel like I have to ask, but you're friendly with the Trump administration, or some in the Trump administration. It's hard to say that they are kind of have a gentle sensibility.
They are not English, conservatives, no. Okay, so first of all, I am not friendly. I got invited to the inauguration and I was instructed to build relationships with the Trump people. Right. This has been done, but what it taught me was what is coming. And I just want to share with everybody that there was huge working class energy in MAGA Square. This was a real rebellion against the lanyard, the thought police, human resources. I mean, in the rotunda in the inauguration, it was Martin Luther King Day, and there was a black preacher from Detroit spoke, and he said, "Free at last, free at last." Can you imagine it? Trump's inauguration on Martin Luther King Day. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last. And you could hear the roars of the crowd outside. And I said, what are you free from? And they said, you. You know, we're free of you. The oppression of work, the policing of speech, it was a genuine, and I can see, so what I say to you is that also I discovered when I was over there, particularly in the conversations with Deepan, he took me around, and they're really dead serious about reindustrialization, trade unions. You know, this is a genuine change of, it's not just a change of administration, it's a change of era that's going on. And I just think that anybody who doesn't try to understand fully the consequences of that is, well, a Guardian reader, really.
Right, should we have some questions? I think we've probably got about 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Jonathan, something like that. Do you want to say who you are and where you're from? And yeah, should we go here first?
Hi there, Mark.
You can
Hudson
stand
here
up.
as an
I can't see you.
Hi there, Mark Hudson here as an individual, really. Obviously, you're no friend of Blair, as you've made clear. I'll just a short question, really. I was wondering what you made of his intervention on net zero the other day.
Should we take three?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, should we take a couple more and then we'll do them? Aisha, and at the back there as well, in the green jumper.
Hello, Morris. Aisha Hazarika here, broadcaster and Labour peer. I'm just really interested what you were saying about bringing back industries. I mean, there was a big moment in Parliament recently where effectively British Steel was renationalised. Do you think this government should be doing more on that front? When you look at our kind of crown jewel industries and national security infrastructure, and then you talk about how kind of recent decades have sort of dehumanised people. Many of us look at the conversations being had about AI and feel that that will be another chapter in this kind of contactless society, the dehumanising of. So I'm just interested on your thoughts on those two things. Thank you.
Thank
and there was a question with the man in the green jumper at the back.
Hi there. Hello.
Yeah.
Thanks for that speech, Morris. My name's David. I run a campaign called Blue Collar Parliament. I was going to ask, where's the space for sort of the traditional working class in the Labour Party as it exists? Because just won a gigantic landslide, or historic landslide, and the vast majority of the MPs come from exactly the same sort of lanyard class that you just lamented. I wonder how you get more people who might be a Reform Labour swing voter back into the Labour movement and the party.
Okay. Yeah, so, I mean, to the first one, straightforward. By the way, it's important to note that Blue Labour always had a preference for Blairites over Brownites, just to let you know. And that was real because we thought that the Blairites were at least amenable to more creative thinking around state reform and those things. Nothing much hangs on it. But yeah, this is, there's a saying in Yiddish, Tom, that my father taught me, which was that a delusion is worse than an illness. It served me very well in my life, just to share it with you. And this whole net zero 2030, it's delusional. Look what happened to Germany. I mean, Germany renounced fossil fuels, it renounced nuclear, and it was parading itself as a paragon of virtue when in fact it was entirely dependent on dirty Russian oil and gas. I mean, it's disgusting. And now Germany is going into freefall. I mean, they've got a new government, but the AfD is growing. This is another thing to talk about, is that the disintegration, particularly of the Social Democrats, is palpable. So to answer your question, in short, Tony Blair spoke complete sense about that. But we really need to intensify the conversation around energy, because if we're going to reindustrialise, and I'll get to this point, it's very straightforward. You need heat. We've been planning our energy policy on the basis that we just need to keep the lights on. But industry requires intense heat, and then it comes absolutely to your point, and this is AI is absolutely critical. The level of energy required to generate it is beyond our capacity. And so there needs to be radical change around that. But actually, AI is crucial to me and to the work we're doing. We place it into a longer tradition. I mean, John Ruskin wrote brilliantly on the machine and the arts and crafts. And essentially the argument was that if you have machines that can do the mundane, then there is a possibility for the development of what is uniquely human. So the threat of AI is palpable, but its possibilities are also huge. There's one thing I just feel morally obliged to say, is that I think that AI can be an incredibly liberating force in decimating the administrative state. This is very important, that we can free up all that so the paradox, big paradox, the bigger the state grows, the more useless it becomes. This is a palpable reality in people's lives. It's not functioning and yet it's massive. So AI can be an incredible, but much more. So I'm working on this essay. I'd love to talk about it with you. I think we work in the same building from time to time and can find the time. It is Ruskin, and then Frank Lloyd Wright wrote exactly a response to that called The Machine and the Arts and Crafts, where he was arguing that greater access to beauty can be liberated by what was considered, obviously, on the labour movement, considered the machine a threat. But it also was an emancipation, and we've got to hold that in line. And certainly when it comes to the integration, essentially what's necessary is to integrate foreign policy, defence policy and industrial policy into one thing. Within that, the necessity of AI is huge. So it's got to be the double movement. How do we engage with this so it makes society more relational, that it frees people, but vocation, arts and crafts. I mean, one of the things, the idea that the Ruskin College doesn't exist anymore is a shame on the labour movement. I mean, this has got to also be restored. So Aisha, I take I'm very, very convinced that AI can be a liberating force as well as a threat. And that's a political approach, not just a technological and commercial approach. In other words, to requote Bevin, I want AI, I want big AI, and I want the Union Jack on it. National systems of that, a Royal College for Artificial Intelligence, all of these things are absolutely necessary, because it can be a really powerful way of liberating what only humans can do. And I think the future lies in human beings doing what only humans can do, which, as we know, is on the whole to fuck it up. So
the lanyard class and the working class,
yeah,
the more working classes.
Yeah. I mean, let's have I really would like obviously, it's been the case for the last 20 to 30 years that I would say that labour culture has been a hostile environment for working class people, because if you actually say what you think, you get condemned. And the inability to express the grief, this is a huge part of the story, is that we see people in pain and we call them far right or populists or nativists or racists or sexist when they're just speaking, and the desire, very progressive thing. Saul Alinsky had a great line here. You could tell a liberal, he says, they always walk out of the room before the argument begins. There's a real hostility to political argument, all of those things. Obviously, the first part of the argument is that if we're a patriotic party that's pro-industry, pro-army, pro-police, we will attract working class support hugely. But there's got to be a cultural change where this thought policing of what is acceptable discourse, the power of HR departments has got to be targeted, maybe through the use of AI. And to create a political space once more in which the people who created our movement are allowed to speak. What's happened is an enclosure. You've got to go to university, you've got to sign up to be compliant with the progressive assumptions in order to in any way flourish. Can you imagine Ernest Bevin being selected as a parliamentary candidate today? I mean, it's
You wouldn't get on the old woman shortlist.
well, that's just the start of it, I think. I mean, it's just, you know, there's a big piece in what I didn't read, brilliant Ernest Bevin on constitutional change. You know, don't fuck with it. That was his sum total contribution, and it was fantastic. So that is what we're living through now, and Blue Labour is a space that is absolutely open to working class leadership and participation.
Should we take three more? There's gentleman here, two ladies at the front here.
Hi, my name's Charles from CT Group. I'm sympathetic to your critique of like neoliberal capitalism, but also how do you square that with the fact that the US and neoliberal capitalism is the biggest wealth-creating machine that history has ever known, and the fact that Mississippi, the poorest state in the United States, has a higher GDP per capita than the UK?
Two at the front here. Yeah.
Sophie de Schwartzbergen, Government Relations Consultant. Thank you for your speech. It's very thought-provoking. I was wondering your thoughts about woke and diversity and inclusion, and I was thinking about the Supreme Court judgment recently and what that means for medals and people who have won medals, well, in terms of sports.
Oh, yes.
And will those, you know, just that whole area, anything you wish to say, would love your thoughts on that.
And right at the front here.
Hi, I'm Catherine McBride. I'm here privately, but I'm a cheerleader for Brexit, and I was surprised that so many of the Labour people seem to want to rejoin the EU, which they claim is a reset. I went to a Westminster Hall debate last week when about 50 Labour people were all desperate to give away the power that they've finally won after being in the wilderness for so long. And what is with this? Why is it we have political class who don't actually want to govern?
Okay. So the first of all is that I do think that the story, the United States is the global hegemon. The rules of the game were in its favour certainly since the post-war. Don't underestimate, or rather, don't believe the fantasy they speak. Universities, vocational colleges, farming banks were all part of the growth of the United States. But now that it's not so much now that it's dealing with the political and economic consequences of globalization, you notice that it's wrecking the system. So my answer to you is that it's always the case, is that those economies flourish most, which allow human dignity and creativity to flourish, and has a balance of institutions that constrain unfettered capitalism. I think what you're going to see now is that's coming back. You know, they say the Industrial Revolution. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, it was a whole combination of church, universities, vocational organisations that enabled these developments to occur. So I'm not convinced by the spontaneous order argument, and I think that the United States is very much a political economy, and it's that's what came to me when I was at the inauguration. It's a continental power. It has natural resources. It has precious metals. It has industrial capability in a way that we completely forgot. Then this. Okay, so this is about the Supreme Court.
Yes, just the woke diversity.
Look, the problem with the Supreme Court thing is that why on earth was it that this was decided in court? This is a political decision that should have been made in Parliament. Should absolutely. We had a fantastic arrangement about abortion. A legislation was passed in Parliament. It wasn't a court. In America, has been plagued by this politicisation of the courts. So, you know, in relation to this, it's just that we're going to look back at another period of absolute progressive insanity, where you could lose your job for saying, "My nan is not a man." You know, it's very aggressive, it wasn't just being kicked out of WhatsApp groups. You could lose your job for saying completely normal, truthful things. So this is just I think it's over. I think that is in retreat. When it comes to sport, what? I mean, I just don't. I don't comprehend what actually happened with all this. But it's completely illegitimate for a man to participate in women's sport. They shouldn't have medals. They should be punished. You know, this is just wrong, and that's just. But that's political. I just have grave reservations about the legal process deciding that. That's should have been a political decision coming from the government. But that this is really, really bonkers, and it goes deeper. You know, in relation to what you asked about blue collar parliament, is that all of this was done outside of any democratic debate. It was pushed by legal, HR, and Labour was quite captured in large part by very insane marginal campaign groups that made a lot of noise on Twitter. I think, as I say, that they're a casualty of the new era, and yeah, okay. You know, thank God for Brexit is what I say every morning when I wake up, because there is no way back. We are going to have to function as a political state and make our decisions in democratic ways. But reality is on our side. As I said, it's never happened in my lifetime that both Germany and France are both in such a downward spiral. I think Britain can be the leading military, diplomatic, political force in Europe. I'm absolutely committed to this alliance with Ukraine. I wrote about it here, so I'll repeat it now, Tom, is that we renew the idea of the Commonwealth, invite Ukraine to join the Commonwealth. Ukraine's got an incredibly effective army, it's got extraordinary natural resources, and it has an incredibly skilled working class. It's outside the EU. This is a natural alliance, so balance of power in Europe is another, so London, Kiev balances against Berlin, Paris. And I think reality is exerting. Obviously, you asked an interesting question. The beauty of being in the ruling class for the last 30 years is that you didn't have to make any decisions, right? So the EU took them and the market took them. Sorry, industrialisation can't do it. I remember in the Brexit referendum we met and I said, if we don't do this, I'm quitting, because there'd be nothing worth doing, because the EU was just an absolute constraint on action. But now we're in an era of national sovereignty. Now we have to have an industrial strategy. Politicians actually have to lead. This is what I'm saying about the Supreme Court. The judges don't lead. The judges work within the constraints of common law and parliament. It's the politicians who've got to lead. And I think this is the change we're witnessing.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. It's
just getting going.
I know, quarter past. As ever, I can always listen to Morris for ages.
You're alone in that.
But yeah, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Again, thank you for Policy Exchange for hosting, to Dean and to Julia. And please come back for further lectures if and when they're announced. Or June the 4th.
On Left Behind.
Okay, we heard it here first. Come back for that, because I think what you're doing is really fascinating and clearly leading a lot of national debate. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to Morris. Really appreciate it.
Really good to see you.